Hello, friends, and welcome to another gathering around the campfire, an invitation to understand something of the ancient world that has impressed itself upon our modern world, 3,000 years later, in fact. And one of the famous stories of the Bible, one that almost everyone knows, I would say, the famous story that we know as Joseph and his brothers, and certainly famous because it became a Broadway hit, Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. And it's a wonderful story in its own right, but it might be missing something. And I'd like to invite us just to begin to explore this story, which has everything to do with wardrobe, especially Joseph's wardrobe. When we think that his father, Jacob, gives Joseph a gift, and we often translate the gift in the Bible as a tunic or a long coat, when in fact the actual word is it's only used in one other time in biblical literature, and it's something that David's daughter Tamar wore, and it's something that princesses wore, as the story specifies in the Deuteronomist work, 2 Samuel. And it's important for us to reread that Joseph story in light of that. So imagine Joseph receives this gift from his father, a dress that princesses wore, and his brothers hate him and they strip him of it. And then Joseph ends up being thrown into slavery, ends up being sold into the house of a eunuch. That's someone who doesn't have testicles, who works for the Pharaoh. And the eunuch's wife, probably in love with Joseph for a lot of reasons, with her husband who has no testicles. Well, she strips Joseph of his clothes, and there he runs away naked, and he ends up eventually in jail. And in jail, he gets a new wardrobe, whatever that might be, which after he begins to learn to interpret dreams, or at least being the only one in the whole empire of Egypt to have the courage to interpret this nasty dream that the Pharaoh has had, eventually is stripped of those clothes and gets cleaned up, even shaves, we're told, which I think might be a key detail to understanding of Joseph's story. And he dresses in new clothes and appears before Pharaoh and has the courage to say what everyone knows is coming, but nobody wants to tell Pharaoh. And he gets then a major promotion, becomes the number 2 to Pharaoh, the number 2 person in the empire, and gets dressed as that, and eventually, while still wearing his clothes, is stripped of those clothes in a sense, or stripped of that identity when he reveals himself to his brothers through his tears. So we can see that this story is something about going back and forth between dressing and stripping, something to do with wardrobe, and how important it is to read a good translation or an honest translation. So I'd like to read first from just the beginning of the story from the New American Bible, which is a Catholic Bible. I used to use this Bible to teach from when I was teaching high school, and for the most part it's a nice translation, but notice how the choices that are made lean the story in a specific direction. So I'm going to take my glasses off to read this around the campfire, and this is what is said. When Joseph was 17 years old, he was tending the flocks with his brothers. He was an assistant to the sons of his father's wives, Bilhah and Zilpah, and he brought his father's bad reports about them. And his father made him a long tunic. When his brothers saw that their father loved him best of all his sons, they hated him, so much so that they wouldn't even greet him. And once Joseph had a dream, which he told his brothers, "Listen to this dream I had. There we were, binding sheaves in the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose to an upright position, and your sheaves formed a ring around my sheaf and bowed down to it." "Are you really going to make yourself king over us?" his brothers asked him, "or impose your rule on us?" So they hated him all the more because of his talk about his dreams. Then he had another dream, and this one too he told to his brothers. "I had another dream," he said. "This time the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he also told it to his father reproved him. "What is the meaning of this dream of yours?" he asked. "Can it be that I and your mother and your brothers are to come and bow down to the ground before you?" So his brothers were wrought up against him, but his father pondered the matter. It's nice. It's a nice translation. But notice in the translation that I've done recently, Sweet Lady J, it's a bit different. It's a bit different what happens here. And so, here we go. And this is how this story starts. And by the way, in my translation, I don't choose the traditional names. Every Hebrew name is linked to some verb and has some clever little meaning to it, especially in the biblical stories. And Joseph is a word that has something to do with adding on. So I actually call him Add-on. And Add-on was 17 years old. He was shepherding the lambs and goats with his brothers. He was a boy compared to the sons of sudden terror and rage, his father's slave wives. Remember, Add-on's father is tricky heel grabber, Jacob. Add-on would go with bad reports and rumors to their father. He made for him a flashy dress, the kind that princesses wore. His brothers saw that their father loved him best from among all the brothers. They hated him. They couldn't stand to speak with him kindly or peacefully. And Add-on was one to dream dreams, and he would speak them out loud to his brothers. They would add it all up together and hate him all the more. He would say to them, "Please listen up to this dream that I dreamt. You see, we're a bunch of grain stalks all gathered together in the middle of the rolling field, and what do you know? My grain stalk was standing up. You know, like I was standing up powerfully in charge. And get this, your grain stalks were surrounding and bowing down to my grain stalk." His brothers said to him, "Why in the world would you even try to be the dictator over us? As if you'd even be able to find some clever way to master us and control us?" They added it all up together and hated him even more because of his dreams and his ideas. And he dreamed another dream, describing it to his brothers and said, "Hey there, listen up! I dreamed another dream. Here it is. The sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me." He described it all to his father and his brothers. His father scolded him and said to him, "What is this dream you're dreaming? I mean, really, do you really think we are going, me and your mother and your brothers, to bow down all the way to the ground to you?" His brothers were jealous of him. His father was careful about things. Notice, they're both translations. They're both looking to the ancient Hebrew for wisdom. But when we begin to enter into the imagination of this writer, who I call Sweet Lady J, who scripture scholars call J, or the Yahwist writer, when we begin to put ourselves into the shoes of this person 3,000 years ago, this woman sitting around a campfire, entertaining people, but not just entertaining people, beginning to shift the consciousness of people, and imagine what would happen to you back then, or maybe it's happening to you right now, to hear a story about this young boy who's given a dress that princesses wore, who eventually becomes the ruler, or at least the number two, the right-hand person of the ruler of the greatest empire of the ancient world, the ancient Mediterranean world anyway. What would happen if you heard a story like this? And notice how it begins just to tease your imagination. And then you'll know something of what Sweet Lady J is up to, just how clever she absolutely is. And this is just one of the stories. So I invite you to begin to pursue this text yourself. Begin to play with it. And certainly, a resource I recommend is this Sweet Lady J translation that I've been working on for a number of years now. And if you do indeed purchase it, please make sure you purchase the one that says at the bottom, revised, updated, and quite surprising, which you can find on our website, vitalitycincinnati.org, I loan all my writings to Vitality to raise funds for our programs, which share self-care, things like yoga, healing touch, Feldenkrais method, movement intelligence, journaling, gardening, all these things that we can do for ourselves to relieve stress. So I invite you to go to vitalitycincinnati.org and check out your interest in purchasing a copy, which helps to raise funds for our nonprofit. So grateful that you joined me with this campfire, and I look forward to many more.